There's a low coral ridge at the southern tip of Okinawa, and on the morning of the 18th of June, 1945, a group of senior officers climbed it to watch the last days of the last great battle of the Pacific War. The fighting below them was almost finished. A 3-star general stood at a forward observation post of the 8th Marines, watching his infantry push the final pockets of resistance toward the sea. He had come up to see the end of it with his own eyes. That is a thing commanders do near the close of a long campaign. They come forward. They want to stand where the men stood. A Japanese gun, a single artillery piece that should not have been able to reach that ridge, put a shell into the coral a few feet away from him. The rock shattered. The fragments went into his chest. Within about 10 minutes, Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., commander of the United States 10th Army, was dead. He remains the highest-ranking American officer to fall to enemy fire in the whole of the Second World War. And in that moment, on a ridge full of Army officers, command of the entire 10th Army, an army of more than 180,000 men, 2 Army Corps and a Marine Corps side by side, passed not to the senior Army general present. It passed to a Marine. It passed to a man who had spent the first half of his career not on a parade ground, but in an open cockpit, a man who had learned to fly when the airplane itself was barely a decade old. For the next several days, the United States 10th Army was commanded by an aviator, the only Marine and the only pilot of any service ever to command a numbered field army of the United States in combat. His name was Roy Stanley Geiger. And here is the part that should stop you. Almost nobody knows that name. There's a very good chance you have never heard it in your life. He wrote no memoir. He gave no interviews. He left almost nothing behind in his own voice. And within 18 months of standing on that ridge, he would be dead himself, and the service he had fought for its entire life would be fighting for its own survival in the halls of Washington. This is the story of the man the history's almost lost. This is the story of Roy Geiger. Let me take you back to the beginning, because at the beginning tells you everything about the man. He was born on the 25th of January, 1885 in Middleburg, Florida, a small farming community in Clay County, the 6th of 7 children. This was rural Florida in the 1880s. His people were farmers, and Roy Geiger did something that almost no farm boy of his time and place did. He got educated, and he got educated well. He went to the Florida State Normal School, and then he earned a law degree from John B. Stetson University, and he took it in 1907. He was, on paper, a young attorney with a professional future in front of him, and then he threw it away, or so it must have looked to everyone around him. On the 2nd of November, 1907, Roy Geiger walked into a recruiting office in St. Paul, Minnesota, and he enlisted in the United States Marine Corps as a private, not as an officer, not with a commission earned off the back of his law degree. As a private, at the very bottom, carrying a rifle. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because it is the first sign of who this man was. A man with a law degree in 1907 had options. Roy Geiger chose the hardest road into the institution he wanted to serve, and he chose to earn his place from the ground up. He made corporal in June of 1908. And then, in February of 1909, having passed his examinations, he was commissioned as second lieutenant of Marines. He had done in about 15 months what most men of his education would have demanded on day one. The lesson stuck to him for life. He never forgot what the bottom felt like. What followed was a decade in the small wars, the expeditionary years the Marine Corps built its soul on. Nicaragua in 1912, where he was in the fighting for the hills at Coyotepe and Barranca, the kind of sharp, close, unforgiving action that taught a young officer what men will and will not do under fire. Sea duty aboard the battleships Wisconsin and Delaware, learning the Navy from the inside, learning how a fleet thinks, a piece of education that would matter enormously 30 years later. Service in the Philippines. And service in China, at the Marine Detachment, guarding the American legation in Peking, one of those far-flung outposts where a handful of Marines stood for the whole country. This was the old Corps, the Corps of landing parties and legation guards and gunboats, the Corps of the Banana Wars, and Roy Geiger was a hard, competent physical officer in it. They called him Jiggs. Some called him Rugged Roy. Neither name was ironic. He was built like a man who had done manual work, and he carried himself like one, and the men around him never mistook him for a soft officer who had bought his way in. He had come up through the ranks, and it showed, and it earned him something that no commission alone can buy, which is the respect of the men who have to follow you. And then, in 1916, at the age of 31, already a captain in waiting with nearly a decade of service behind him, Roy Geiger did the second thing that defined his life. He volunteered to fly. If you want to understand how early this was, understand this. He reported to the Naval Air Station at Pensacola as a student aviator on the 31st of March, 1916. The Wright brothers had flown at Kitty Hawk in 1903. The airplane was 13 years old. On the 9th of June, 1917, First Lieutenant Roy Geiger was designated Naval Aviator number 49. Let that number land. 49. Out of every human being the United States Navy and Marine Corps had ever certified to fly, he was the 49th. He was Marine Corps Aviator number 5. He was, quite literally, one of the first handful of Marines ever to leave the ground under power. That fact comes straight out of the official Marine Corps history of its own early aviation, and I have gone back through it for this, because with a man this obscure, you cannot rely on the second-hand tellings. You have to go to the record. If you are getting something out of this, out of the fact that we go back to the primary record instead of repeating the same 3 paragraphs everyone else repeats, then subscribing genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm that this kind of deep research is worth showing to more people, and it lets me keep making these the way they ought to be made. Now, back to Roy Geiger and the First World War, because the war was on, and the new aviator was about to go to it. In July of 1918, Roy Geiger arrived in France. He was given command of an airplane squadron, Squadron 2 of the 1st Marine Aviation Force, and that force was attached to the day wing of the Northern Bombing Group, a United States Navy formation flying out of the coast near Dunkirk alongside the Royal Air Force. They flew the de Havilland day bombers, the DH-4 and the DH-9, the workhorses of that first air war, wood and wire and a single engine out front, and they went after the German-held rail junctions and the bases that supported the U-boat campaign along the Belgian coast. Geiger commanded that squadron. He trained it, and he led it into the air over the guns. For that, he was awarded the Navy Cross, the citation naming him as commanding officer of the squadron who trained and led his men on bombing raids against the enemy. I want you to picture what that flying actually was, because the men who did it are gone now, and the machines they did it in would frighten a modern pilot half to death. The de Havilland day bomber was an open cockpit biplane, no armor to speak of, no parachute you could count on, a single engine out front, and if it quit over the German lines, you came down in German hands or you did not come down alive. The men flew in leather and wool against a cold that reached into the bone, navigated by landmark and by dead reckoning, and pressed home their attacks on the rail yards and the submarine bases, while the anti-aircraft fire walked up toward them from below. Geiger's Marines were part of the first American raids in force in that coastal campaign. It was dangerous, unglamorous, grinding work, and it built in Geiger a thing that never left him, a bone-deep understanding of what he was asking of the young men he sent up, because he'd been up there himself in the same kind of machine. Now here is a thing worth saying plainly, because your fathers and grandfathers who flew would want it said. This was not the famous American air war of the pursuit aces over the trenches, the war of the scarves and the victory tallies painted on the fuselage. The 1st Marine Aviation Force flew under British operational control in the coastal bombing campaign, far from where the newsreels were pointing, and history has largely walked past it. That is a pattern you're going to see again and again in this man's life. He was always where the real work was being done, and almost never where the cameras were pointing. Remember that. It matters at the end. The war ended, and most of the men who had learned to fly in it went back to the ground or went home altogether. Roy Geiger didn't either. He stayed with aviation, and across the 1920s and 1930s, he became one of the small group of officers who took the Marine Corps into the air permanently and gave it a reason to be there. He commanded a squadron in Haiti, where Marine aviators were among the first men anywhere to work out how to bomb from a diving airplane, rolling over into a steep dive and releasing low so the bomb went where the pilot was pointing, rather than where the wind carried it. That technique would become dive bombing, the thing that would sink Japanese carriers at Midway a generation later, and it was born in these small, forgotten campaigns, worked out by Marine pilots porting Marines on the ground. That is the seed of the whole idea Geiger carried for the rest of his life, that the airplane and the infantrymen belong to the same fight. Then he did the thing that made him unusual. He went to school, everyone's school. He went to the Army's Command and General Staff School at Fort Leavenworth and graduated in 1925. He went to the Army War College at Carlisle and graduated in 1929. He went to the Naval War College. Understand what that means. This was not some cowboy in a leather helmet. This was one of the most thoroughly schooled officers in the entire Marine Corps. A man who had sat in the classrooms of all 3 services, who had studied how the Army moves a corps and how the Navy fights a fleet and how the Marines put men on a hostile beach, and who understood, from the inside, how each of those institutions thought. Very few officers of his generation had that whole picture in one head, keep that in your mind too, because it is going to matter more than anything else he ever did. From 1931 to 1935, Roy Geiger ran Marine Corps aviation. He was the director of aviation, the officer in charge of the whole enterprise. And in those years, the doctrine of what marine air was for got carved in stone, and Geiger carved a good part of it. There's a line of his from that era, from when he commanded the aircraft of the East Coast Expeditionary Force, that tells you the whole philosophy in a single breath. The primary reason for the Marine Corps having airplanes, he said, is their close support of ground troops. Now, if you have watched the other films on this channel, you know that in these same years, the Army Air Corps was building a very different faith. The faith that the bomber would win wars on its own, high and far and alone, and that supporting the soldier on the ground was beneath the dignity of air power. That argument got a lot of crews killed in the skies over Germany, and we have told that story here more than once. Roy Geiger was building the exact opposite doctrine. Air power exists to help the man on the ground live and win. It is one of the quiet ironies of the whole war that the two visions grew up at the very same time, and that the man who built the second one is the one nobody remembers. By August of 1941, with the country sliding toward a war it could feel coming, Roy Geiger was a brigadier general commanding the 1st Marine Aircraft Wing. And then the Japanese came to Pearl Harbor, and the theory was over, and the killing began. And it is here, in the worst place in the world in the autumn of 1942, that Roy Geiger stopped being an administrator and became a legend to the men who served under him. The place was called Guadalcanal. If you know one thing about Guadalcanal, know this. The Americans took a single airfield on that island in August of 1942, named it Henderson Field, and then spent months in a knife fight to keep it, because whoever held that airstrip controlled the sky over the southern Solomons, and whoever controlled that sky controlled whether the men on the island lived or died. The aircraft that flew off that battered strip of dirt and pierced steel plank became known as the Cactus Air Force, Cactus being the code name for the island. It was a scratch force, a mongrel force, Marine squadrons and Navy squadrons and Army Air Forces squadrons, all thrown in together and told to hold. On the 3rd of September, 1942, a transport plane came down onto Henderson Field carrying the new commander of Marine Aviation on Guadalcanal. Roy Geiger stepped off it. He was 57 years old. He set up his headquarters in a wooden pagoda, a Japanese structure about 200 yards from the airstrip. And from there, he ran the air battle for the most important piece of real estate in the Pacific. I want to give you the conditions, because the men who lived them earned that much. The pilots flew the Grumman Wildcat, the F-4 F-4 model, the one with the folding wings and the .650 caliber guns, a stubby barrel of an airplane that was slower and less nimble than the Japanese Zero and made up for it with armor and toughness and pilots who learned to fight it smart. They flew the dauntless dive bomber, the SBD, off that same strip against Japanese ships. The Army sent in its Airacobras, and they did all of it while being bombed almost every single day around noon when the Japanese bombers came down from Rabaul, and shelled almost every single night by Japanese warships offshore. I want to be exact about the machines because the men watching this know their airframes cold, and they are right too. The fighter was the Grumman Wildcat, the F-4 F-4, blue-gray on top and pale underneath, 6 guns in the wings and a barrel of a fuselage. It could not turn with a Zero, and every pilot who tried to learn it the hard way or died learning it. What it could do was take punishment and dish it out in a fast diving pass, and the men who flew it worked out the tactics that let a tougher, heavier airplane beat a lighter, nimbler one. The dive bomber was the Douglas Dauntless, the SBD, and off that same dirt strip, it went after Japanese ships in the waters around the island. And a note for the sharp-eyed among you who freeze the frame on the old footage. The national marking on those airplanes in the autumn of 1942 was the plain white star on a blue circle, no red center. That had been ordered off back in the spring to stop our pilots confusing it with the Japanese marking. And no white bars yet either. The bars did not come until the middle of 1943. If you ever see a Guadalcanal airplane in a painting wearing the star and bars, somebody got the date wrong. There is one night that stands for all of them. On the 13th and 14th of October, 1942, 2 Japanese battleships stood off the coast and fired more than 700 heavy shells directly into Henderson Field over the course of the night. This was not a bombing raid. This was the main battery of capital ships firing point blank at an airfield full of men in foxholes and sandbagged revetments. 6 of Geiger's pilots were killed on the ground, in the dark, without ever leaving the earth. The field was cratered. Aircraft were burning. Much of the aviation fuel was gone. And in the morning, Geiger's mechanics did what the Cactus Air Force always did. They scavenged fuel from wrecked aircraft and from drums cached in the jungle. They filled the craters. They patched the runway with steel plank. And they put airplanes back into the sky to attack the very ships that were still landing Japanese troops down the coast. There is a story, and it is a true one, that at one point Geiger sent his own personal transport plane, a PBY flying boat, a slow, unarmed patrol craft never meant to attack anything, outloaded with bombs against Japanese ships, because he would spend anything he had. The man was 57 years old, and he flew at least one combat mission himself off that strip. That was the commander. That was the standard he set. And standards like that travel downward through an organization faster than any order ever could. One of the men who served under him described the atmosphere of Geiger's command in a way that has always stayed with me. He said there was a sense of desperation, but never of defeatism. Sit with that distinction, because it is the whole art of command under pressure. Everyone knew how bad it was. Nobody was allowed to believe they would lose. Geiger himself was remembered as curt, cold, and by some accounts ruthless, a man determined to squeeze the last possible ounce of performance out of every man and every machine he had, because the margin was that thin and he knew it. And the aces came out of that furnace. The young men who flew under Geiger at Guadalcanal became some of the most famous fighter pilots the Marine Corps ever produced. John Smith, Marion Carl, the first Marine ace, a name some of you have been asking me to cover, and I hear you, and his time is coming. Robert Galler, Joe Foss, who arrived in October and would end the campaign as one of the highest scoring aces in the theater. 4 of the Marine aviators who fought in that campaign earned the Medal of Honor. They flew the airplanes. Geiger built the machine that let them fly and kept it running when by every rational measure it should have collapsed. Now I want to give you the numbers, because this is a channel that respects your intelligence and gives you the real figures instead of the vague ones. And I want to be careful and honest with them, the way I always try to be. Because the men watching this know that the wartime claims and the verified reality are not always the same thing. On the 11th of September 1942, there were 1,014 aviation personnel on Guadalcanal, and of those, 917 were Marines, 64 were Navy, and 33 were Army. That comes from the official 1st Marine Aircraft Wing record. The citation for Geiger's Gold Star, the decoration he received for the campaign, credits the aircraft under his command with shooting down 268 Japanese planes between the 3rd of September and the 4th of November, 1942. And here is where the honesty comes in. That is a wartime figure, and the wartime figures were high across the board, on all sides, in every theater. The historian John Lundstrom, in his study of the Navy fighter squadrons in that campaign, called the First Team and the Guadalcanal campaign, went back through it carefully and showed that the claims outran the reality, as claims always did. The men were not lying. In the chaos of a swirling fight, 3 pilots would each honestly believe they had downed the same aircraft. So when I tell you the Cactus Air Force claimed to have destroyed more than 250 Japanese planes, I'm telling you what they claimed, and I'm trusting you to understand the difference, because you have earned that trust. What is not in dispute is the result. They held the field. The sky over Guadalcanal stayed American. And in November of 1942, with the crisis broken, Roy Geiger handed his exhausted command to his chief of staff and went home to run all of Marine aviation as its director. That should have been the shape of his war. The old aviator, the pioneer, the man who held Henderson Field, climbing to a desk in Washington to direct the air arm he had helped build. A distinguished ending. And if that had been the ending, you would have even less reason to have ever heard his name. Instead, Roy Geiger did the thing that makes him unique in the entire history of the United States Armed Forces. He came back to the Pacific. And he came back not to command airplanes. He came back to command men on the ground. This is the hinge of the whole story, so let me be precise about how it happened, because it is easy to say and hard to grasp. In October of 1943, the general commanding the 1st Marine Amphibious Corps, a man named Charles Barrett, died in an accident just as the Corps was about to go into the fight for Bougainville. The commander of the entire Marine effort in the theater, Alexander Vandegrift, stepped in to steady the Corps for a few days. But Vandegrift was needed elsewhere, and a permanent commander had to be found, and found immediately, with the operation already in motion. Command was in genuine crisis, and the Marine Corps reached, of all the men it could have chosen, for Roy Geiger, the aviator. On the 9th of November 1943, at Cape Torquina on Bougainville, the landings already underway and the beachhead still contested, Roy Geiger took command of an entire amphibious corps of ground troops. Now stop and feel the weight of that for a second, because I do not want it to slide past you as just another line in a career. This is a man who had spent almost 30 years mastering the air. His hands knew the controls of an airplane. His mind knew formations and fuel loads and the geometry of an air battle. And in the middle of a war, with an assault underway and men already ashore and dying, he is handed the command of infantry and artillery and the whole apparatus of a ground corps. And he is expected to command it in the single most complicated thing two services can do together, which is put an army onto a defended shore and keep it there. Most men, handed that, would have failed, and no one would have blamed them for it, because it was not their trade. Roy Geiger did not fail. He commanded that corps, and he commanded it well. Think about how strange that is. Think about how strange it would be in any military organization. You have spent your whole professional life mastering one demanding craft, the craft of air power, from the cockpit of a 1917 trainer all the way up to running the whole enterprise. And now, at 58 years old, you are handed a corps of infantry, artillery, and armor, tens of thousands of ground-fighting men, and told to command them in the most difficult operation in warfare, the amphibious assault of a defended island. There is no one else in the American military who made that leap and made it work. An official Marine Corps historian, Cyril O'Brien, wrote that Geiger was the first Marine aviator to head as large a ground command. He does not add the word only, but the record does. No aviator did it on this scale before him, and none did it after. And here is the thing the fact-checkers among you will want, and you are right to want it. This is exactly why it worked at the end, because Roy Geiger, alone among the senior men in that theater, had genuinely done both. He understood the air, and he had learned the ground. When you put those together in one skull, you get something the American military of that era almost never produced, a true joint commander, a man who could see the whole battle instead of just his own piece of it. A recent study of Geiger out of the Air Force's own Advanced School of Air and Space Studies argues exactly that Geiger was the prototype of the Joint Force Commander, decades before the American military officially learned to think that way. He was ahead of his institution. And you already know, if you have watched this channel before, what tends to happen to the men who are ahead of their institution. His corps was soon redesignated the 3rd Amphibious Corps, and Geiger took it into the two hardest fights of his life. The first was Guam, in the summer of 1944, the retaking of American soil, because Guam had been an American possession that the Japanese had seized in the days after Pearl Harbor. Getting it back carried a weight beyond the map. Geiger commanded the whole assault force, and it was a genuinely joint one. The 3rd Marine Division, a Marine Brigade, and one full Army Infantry Division, the 77th, all under the hand of a Marine aviator. The total American strength committed was more than 65,000 men. And this is the part I want you to hold on to, because it is the thing that made the ending possible. Geiger was, right here at Guam, commanding Army soldiers and Marines together in the same operation, and making it work. The fighting was hard, and it was hot, and the ground was bad, but Geiger ran it well, and on the 10th of August, 1944, organized resistance ended, and Guam was American again. Geiger served as its first military governor. The American cost was on the order of 1,800 men killed and around 6,000 wounded, figures that come from the campaign order of battle, and I give them to you as a range on purpose, because different authorities count them slightly differently, and I'm not going to pretend to a precision the sources do not have. The Japanese garrison of around 19,000 men was almost entirely destroyed, its commander among the dead. And then came Peleliu. And Peleliu is where you see the other half of Roy Geiger, the half that makes him a hero of this channel and not just a footnote, because Peleliu is where the competent man collided head-on with a bad decision and made the right call anyway. Here is the situation. In September of 1944, Geiger's corps was sent to take a small coral island called Peleliu in the palace for its airfield. The commander of the 1st Marine Division, the division that would make the main assault, was a general named William Rupertus. And Rupertus told his men and told his superiors that the operation would be over in 4 days, maybe 3. He said it with total confidence. It was not over in 4 days. It lasted more than 2 months. It became one of the most savage and one of the most bitterly argued battles of the entire Pacific War. The Japanese had abandoned the old suicidal beach defense. They had dug themselves into a honeycomb of caves and tunnels in the coral ridges, and they intended to make the Americans pay for every yard, and they did. Now watch what Roy Geiger does, because this is the man entire. Before the landing, Geiger had been uneasy. He learned that the pre-invasion naval bombardment was to be cut short, and he pushed to add a 3rd day of it, understanding that his men on the beach would need every shell fired before they got there. Then, once the fight was on, and the 1st Marines, the regiment led by the legendary Lewis Puller, the man they called Chesty, was being ground into nothing against the ridges, Geiger did something that took real moral courage. On the 21st of September, he went forward himself to Puller's command post, and he looked at the state of that regiment with his own eyes. It had taken something close to 1,700 casualties. It was, as a fighting formation, finished. And General Rupertus did not want to admit it. Rupertus was a Marine to his marrow, and the idea of pulling out a shattered Marine regiment and putting Army soldiers in to do the job was, to him, close to unbearable. But Roy Geiger was the Corps commander, and Roy Geiger had spent his life around both services, and he did not have room in his head for that kind of pride when men were dying to feed it. He overrode Rupertus. He ordered a regiment of the Army's 81st Infantry Division forward to relieve the destroyed Marine regiment. He put the mission ahead of the tribalism. And that is the pattern of Roy Geiger's entire life, showing up in one hard decision. The man who came up from private, the man who flew under the British when nobody was watching, the man who learned the other services' schools, he simply did not care whose uniform did the job, as long as the job got done and fewer of his men died doing it. And here I have to give you the larger argument about Peleliu, because it is one of the great controversies of the Pacific War, and you deserve the whole of it. Many historians now believe the battle should never have been fought at all. Admiral William Halsey himself recommended that the operation be cancelled, that Peleliu be bypassed and left to wither. He was overruled. The great naval historian Samuel Eliot Morison later wrote that it would take more arguments than he could muster to prove the operation was necessary, and that Halsey had been right, and that the island should have been left alone. The airfield they bled for turned out to matter very little to the rest of the war. I lay that out not to take anything from the men who fought there, but because it sharpens what Geiger did. He was handed an operation of dubious value, run by a subordinate whose optimism outran the facts, and in the middle of it, he still found the clarity to make the humane and correct decision. The casualty figures at Peleliu are argued over to this day. The 1st Marine Division alone suffered somewhere between about 6,500 and 7,800 casualties, depending on which authority you count, and I give you the range on purpose, because anyone who hands you a single clean number for Peleliu is selling you a false precision. One of Puller's battalions was effectively destroyed, with a casualty rate above 70%. If any of this is landing with you, and especially if you had family in the Pacific, in the Marine divisions, or the Cactus Air Force, or the Army divisions that fought alongside them, I would genuinely like to hear about it. If your father or your grandfather flew off Henderson Field, or came ashore at Guam, or Peleliu, or Okinawa, or worked the flight line or the aid stations, drop it in the comments. Those stories matter, and they are the real record, and this community has become a place where they get told. A lot of you have been asking for the Marine side of the air war, and this one is for you, because now we come to the end. Now we come to Okinawa, and to that coral ridge, and to the 5 days that made Roy Geiger unique, and then very nearly erased him. Okinawa was the last battle. The invasion began on the 1st of April, 1945, and it was the largest amphibious operation of the Pacific War. The force that took it was the 10th Army, under Lieutenant General Buckner, and it was a genuinely joint army, the only field army headquarters in the entire war to hold an Army Corps and a Marine Corps side by side as equals. Buckner commanded the whole thing. Under him, John Hodge commanded the Army's 24th Corps, and Roy Geiger commanded the Marines' 3rd Amphibious Corps. More than 180,000 men went in. It was a brutal, grinding, 82-day battle. Not the swift island seizures of earlier in the war, but something closer to the worst of the First World War. A slow, costly push against dug-in defenders on ridge after ridge, in the mud, under the kamikazes that were tearing the fleet apart offshore. The numbers give you the scale of it, and I will hand them to you as ranges, because the authorities differ, and you deserve to know that they differ. American deaths in the campaign are counted at more than 12,000, with total American casualties around 50,000. And among those American dead, the Navy's share was the heaviest of any service, because of the kamikazes striking the ships offshore. The National World War II Museum puts the American dead above 12,000. The official Army history counts the Japanese military dead at more than 107,000. And the Okinawan civilians, the people who simply lived there, died in numbers that the sources place anywhere from around 100,000 to 150,000, though some careful modern historians think the higher end is too high. However you count it, Okinawa was one of the costliest battles of the entire Pacific War, and it is against that backdrop of loss that everything on that coral ridge happened. and by the middle of June, it was almost won. The Japanese defense had been pushed to the very southern tip of the island and was collapsing. Which brings us back to where we began. The 18th of June, 1945. Buckner comes forward to watch the end. The single shell finds the ridge, and Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, Jr., the highest-ranking American to fall to enemy fire in the entire war, is gone within 10 minutes. Now here is the detail that most tellings leave out, and it is the detail that makes the whole thing make sense. Buckner had already decided who would take over if something happened to him, and he had not chosen the senior Army officer available. He had chosen Roy Geiger, and he had chosen him for a specific, documented reason that Geiger, alone among the Corps commanders, had already proven he could command both Army and Marine formations together, at Bougainville and at Guam. Buckner knew exactly what he had in Geiger. He had the one man in the theater who had done all of it. So, on the 18th of June, 1945, Roy Geiger, a Marine, an aviator, Naval Aviator number 49, assumed command of the United States 10th Army, and was promoted to Lieutenant General to hold it. And in that instant, he became the only officer of the Marine Corps, and the only aviator of any American service ever to command a numbered field army of the United States in combat. It had never happened before. It has never happened since. A man who had learned to fly when the airplane was 13 years old now commanded an army of the ground. He did the job. He was not a placeholder. Under his command in those days, the last organized Japanese resistance on Okinawa collapsed. On the 21st and 22nd of June, Roy Geiger declared the island secured. The last battle of the Pacific War was, effectively, finished under the command of a Marine aviator. And then, on the 23rd of June, 1945, 5 days after he took command, the United States Army sent a full General Joseph Stilwell to relieve him and take command of the 10th Army. 5 days. And here is where I have to be careful and honest and give you both readings, because this is exactly the kind of moment where a lazy telling picks the dramatic version and runs with it, and you deserve better than that. What does that 5-day relief mean? There is one reading, and it is the one that fits everything this channel is about, and I feel its pull, and I am going to be honest that I feel it. That reading says, the Army could not tolerate the sight of a Marine commanding a United States field army for 1 day longer than absolutely necessary, and moved with unusual speed to put an Army general back in the chair and restore what it saw as the natural order of things. And you cannot simply dismiss that reading, because the backdrop supports it. The Army and the Marine Corps had spent the Central Pacific at each other's throats over exactly this kind of question. The most famous case had come only the year before at Saipan, where a Marine general, Holland Smith, relieved an Army division commander, Ralph Smith, of his command. That single act poisoned the relationship between the two services in the Pacific for the rest of the war. It became known, bitterly, as Smith versus Smith, and Army leaders did not forget it. So when a Marine took over an entire army at Okinawa a year later, it landed in ground that was already sown with salt. Stilwell himself left behind private diary comments, sneering at what he saw as the mutual admiration between the Navy and the Marines on Okinawa. The tension was real, and it was ugly, and Roy Geiger, the man who had spent his whole life refusing to care about which service got the credit, was sitting right on the fault line of a quarrel between the services that he personally wanted no part of. But there is a second reading, and intellectual honesty demands I give it to you with the same weight. The 10th Army was an army formation. Geiger's succession was understood by everyone, including Geiger, as temporary from the very first hour, a bridge until a suitable senior army commander could arrive. And Stilwell was not just any general. He was a full 4-star general, senior and available, a man being lined up for high command in the planned invasion of Japan itself. By that reading, replacing a Marine lieutenant general with an Army full general at the head of an army was not an insult at all. It was simply the machine working the way the machine was built to work. And the official Marine Corps history of the campaign, written by Joseph Alexander, does not frame Okinawa as a Marine grievance at all. It frames it as joint service cooperation at its finest, and it gives Geiger credit for carrying Buckner's teamwork through to the end. So which is it? And my honest answer, after going through this, is that there is no smoking gun. There is no document where an Army leader writes down that Geiger was pulled because he was a Marine. What there is optics. A Marine held a United States field army, and within 5 days he was relieved. And that image, whatever the paperwork intended, went straight into the deepest fear the Marine Corps carried. And to understand that fear, You have to follow Roy Geiger past the war, into the last, and in some ways most important chapter of his life, the one that proves he was not just a fighter, but one of the clearest-sighted men in the entire American military. Because in the summer of 1946, the war won, Roy Geiger was sent to observe something that would change everything. He was the official Marine Corps observer at the atomic bomb tests at Bikini Atoll, Operation Crossroads, where the United States detonated nuclear weapons against a fleet of target ships to see what the atom would do to sea power. Most of the men who watched those tests saw a spectacle. Roy Geiger saw the future, and he saw it more clearly than almost anyone. He sat down and he wrote a letter to the Commandant of the Marine Corps, Alexander Vandegrift, and in that letter he said something that took extraordinary vision for its moment. He wrote that since a future enemy would also have this weapon, a complete review of the entire concept of amphibious operations would have to be made. And then he wrote the line that should be carved somewhere, because it is the whole thing in a sentence. He wrote that he could not visualize another landing such as the ones executed at Normandy or at Okinawa. That letter is preserved in the official Marine Corps history of its early helicopter program, written by Eugene Rawlins, which is where I went to confirm the words. Because you do not put a quotation like that in front of an audience like this one without going to the source. Understand what Geiger was saying. He had just spent the war perfecting the massed amphibious assault, the great fleet standing off a beach and pouring men ashore in waves. It was his life's work. And he looked at the atomic bomb, and he understood immediately that his life's work was obsolete, that one weapon could now destroy an entire invasion fleet packed together off a beach, that the future of getting Marines ashore could not be a huge fleet sitting still. It would have to be dispersed, spread out, and brought in fast from over the horizon. And Vandegrift listened. He acted on Geiger's warning at once. He convened a board of officers to study exactly what the atom meant for amphibious warfare. And that study led, in a direct and traceable line, to the Marine Corps developing helicopter assault. The idea of flying Marines ashore from ships, spread safely over the horizon, the concept they would come to call vertical envelopment. The first experimental helicopter squadron and the first helicopter assault doctrine manual in the world came out of the process Roy Geiger's letter set in motion. Read that again and understand what it makes him. The old aviator, at the very end of his life, looked at the future of war and saw it correctly and pushed his service to change before the evidence forced it to. That is the exact opposite of the bomber theorists we have covered on this channel, the men who clung to a beautiful theory long after the bodies proved it wrong. Geiger did the rarest thing a military man can do. He argued his own life's work into obsolescence because the truth demanded it. And if you have spent any time in any large organization, you already know how rare that is. Most people defend the thing they built long past the point of sense, because the thing they built is who they are. The person who can look at their own masterpiece and say, "This is finished, we need something new," is almost never the person who gets rewarded for it. Usually they get quietly moved aside by the people still protecting the old way. It does not, thank God, usually get anyone killed. In Geiger's world, it would have. But here's the tragedy that sits underneath all of it. While Roy Geiger was seeing the future so clearly, the Marine Corps itself was fighting for its life, and not against any foreign enemy. In the years right after the war, there was a powerful push in Washington to unify the armed forces under a single defense establishment. And inside that push was a real and documented effort to fold Marine aviation into the new independent Air Force and to shrink the Marine Corps down toward almost nothing, on the argument that in the atomic age, a second land army with its own Air Force was a redundant relic the country could not afford. This was not a rumor the Marines invented to feel persecuted. The intent was written down in staff papers, and the most senior leadership of the Army and the emerging Air Force largely favored cutting the Corps down. The Commandant, Alexander Vandegrift, the same man who received Geiger's warning about the atom, had to go before the Senate in the spring of 1946 and give one of the most famous speeches in the history of the Marine Corps. He told the Congress that the very existence of the Corps seemed to stand as a standing affront to the Army staff, and he said that the bended knee was not a tradition of the Corps. He said that the Marine, as a fighting man, had made his case over 170 years of service, and that if that record was not enough, then he must go, but that the Corps would not kneel and beg for its life. It survived. The National Security Act of 1947 preserved the Marine Corps, and preserved its aviation and its amphibious mission by law, the very mission Geiger had spent his life building, and then, at the end, reinventing for the atomic age. And now put the two things together, the 5-day relief at Okinawa and the fight for the Corps' survival in Washington, and you understand why that image mattered so much. Whatever the Army actually intended on the 23rd of June, 1945, the sight of a Marine holding a United States field army and then being replaced within days landed inside an institution that genuinely believed the other services wanted it gone. That is why the story carried the charge it did. That is why, to this day, some Marines tell it as a slight. The paperwork may have been routine. The wound it touched was not. Roy Geiger did not live to see much of the aftermath. He commanded the Fleet Marine Force in the Pacific after the war, and then he came home to Marine Corps headquarters. And there, on the 23rd of January, 1947, still on active duty, just short of 40 years of service and just short of a planned retirement, Roy Geiger died of leukemia at the Naval Hospital at Bethesda. He was 61 years old. The Congress of the United States, the 80th Congress, promoted him to full General 4 stars, effective the day of his death. It is the rank he holds on the rolls of the Marine Corps forever. He is buried at Arlington. So let me give you the verdict, because on this channel we give credit where it is earned and we criticize where that is earned too. And with Roy Geiger, the ledger is not hard to read. Here's a man who enlisted as a private with a law degree in his pocket because he wanted to earn his place, who became the 49th aviator in the history of the sea services, one of the first Marines ever to fly, who commanded a bomber squadron in the First World War in a campaign history forgot, who spent the interwar years building, almost from nothing, the doctrine that marine air exists to protect the man on the ground, the exact humane opposite of the doctrine that got so many bomber crews killed over Europe, who, at 57 years old, held Henderson Field in the worst days on Guadalcanal, and would spend anything, including his own airplane and nearly his own life, to keep the sky American. Who then did the single most improbable thing in the history of the American Officer Corps, and crossed from the cockpit to the command of a ground corps, and did it so well that when the highest-ranking American of the war fell on a coral ridge, it was this aviator who took command of an entire field army, the only Marine and the only pilot ever to do it, who, when a subordinate's pride would have fed more Marines into a meat grinder at Peleliu, overrode that pride and brought in the army and saved lives, because he never cared whose uniform did the work. And who, at the very end, looked at the atomic bomb and saw the death of his own life's work and told his service the truth about it, and set in motion the thing that would carry the Marine Corps into the next 50 years. And almost nobody knows his name. Why? And this is the honest answer, and it is the answer that ties this man to every other buried figure we have talked about on this channel. Part of it is simple bad luck. He died early, in 1947, before the memoirs and the reunions and the histories got written, and unlike so many of his contemporaries, he left almost nothing in his own voice. No memoir, no oral history, no campaign to burnish his own legend. The men who write their own story get remembered. Geiger did not write his, and part of it is the deeper thing, the thing this whole channel exists to say out loud. He was over and over exactly where the hardest and most important work was being done, and almost never where the credit was being handed out. Under the British in the First World War, in the mongrel Cactus Air Force, crossing between two services that each wanted to claim their own, holding an army for 5 days and handing it over without a fuss, seeing the future and pushing his service toward it instead of standing on a stage to take a bow. He did the work. Other men, in almost every case, stood in the light. I think that is the truest measure of Roy Geiger, and I will give you my own view of it plainly, because you come here for the honest opinion and not the safe one. I think he was one of the 2 or 3 most complete commanders the United States produced in that entire war, a genuine joint warrior decades before his institution had a word for it, and I think the reason you have never heard of him is not that he did too little. It is that he did too much, in too many places, under too many flags, and never once stopped to make sure his own name was on it. The histories reward the men who point at themselves. Roy Geiger spent 40 years pointing at the work. He was the private who earned his commission. He was the 49th man to fly. He was the general who held the field and crossed to the ground and commanded the army and saw the future. And he did it all without ever asking you to remember him. So remember him. That's the story. The sources are in the description. I'll see you in the next one.